I wanted first to sketch the outlines of the landscape when it comes to covering government and others in power. Myra McPherson's wonderful biography of Stone is entitled All Governments Lie, which is a condensation of Stone's statement that all governments are run by liars. I've got huge respect for many of the government officials I've covered, but at the same time, I have to agree that the relationship between those of us in the press and the people we cover, if you do your job right, is full of tension and often downright hostility. Stone was famous for being an outsider who disparaged some of the insiders like Walter Lippmann. And while I think there's room for both kinds of coverage, I tend to agree with Stone on his skepticism about getting too cozy. I learned this lesson early on, not long after coming to Washington in 1984 to cover the Reagan White House for the Wall Street Journal. I learned that Reagan's embattled national security advisor was about to resign. So using the privileged access I had as reporter for the Wall Street Journal, I quickly went to see him and asked him about this point blank. And with sort of warm brown eyes that kind of looked like a trustworthy Labrador retriever, he looked across the desk at me and told me that he had absolutely no plans to resign. So I may be telescoping this in memory, but as I remember it, the very next day, after I'd shelved my story, they announced his resignation. And I was stunned. Government officials lie. They lie to reporters boldly and straight-faced. And it taught me that access is overrated, which is something to keep in mind in this era of celebrity interviews. And that they may look friendly and be wonderfully inspirational and be really attractive characters and the kind of people you wish you could be friends with, but never to forget that the relationship between the reporters and the subjects that we cover in power is by necessity one that is adversarial and sometimes full of distrust and opposition. Small lies like that minor one, seem relatively minor today, now that we've seen things like a government practically manufacturing a false rationale for a war or denying the existence of a torture program. But the lesson remains the same. As Stone put it, you can't just sit on their lap and ask them to feed you secrets. Then they'll just give you a lot of crap. The other thing I learned early on while covering the Reagan White House, and which I think bears remembering today, is that when you do hop off their laps, as Stone's own struggles illustrated, you're not going to get pats on the head. As we deal with the augmented powers of the growing national security state, it's worth remembering that those in power are rarely on the side of a fully free and transparent coverage. A minor brush I had in the Reagan White House alerted me to this dynamic. Eager to reveal the extensive and expensive stagecraft behind Reagan's presidency, I thought it would be great to fly to Grenada a week ahead of the president's visit there to celebrate the first anniversary of America's victory over leftist forces on the tiny backward Caribbean island. I have to remember, though, also my bureau chief at the time, Al Hunt, when I gave him the story proposal, picked it up, and he said, "I smell a little suntan lotion on this thing." But I've been very lucky to work for fantastic places, the Wall Street Journal and then the New Yorker, and they indulged me. So anyway, I went to Grenada a week ahead of the president, and I watched as the president's image advisors oversaw the paving of all these little dirt roads with beautiful new asphalt. And one Air Force cargo plane after the next landed in this little dirt patch of an airport, carrying limousines and ambulances and bleachers and flags and everything else. And anyway, it made for a great story, but when the offending story was published, what I remember was sitting in the press briefing room as a young reporter, and the president's spokesman at the time, Larry Speaks, looked across the podium at me. He was like red-faced and angry, and he said, "You are out of business." So then my colleagues at the time sort of thoughtfully and generously held a going out of business sale. They carried my desk and chair onto the lawn of the White House. But you know, behind the hijinks was a serious message, which is that when reporters challenge the official narrative, those in power are going to push back, and sometimes very hard.